We're here today discussing the fighting in 1916 in the City Hall and Dublin Castle area. In the talk we're presenting evidence that we've uncovered of how Willie Halpin from East Wall was the last commander of the garrison here after the previous two had been killed. For 24 hours he was targeted by the British, but they still didn't manage to kill him. We're also presenting evidence that shows that the garrison never surrendered, that ultimately the garrison was captured. And I think that's important because one of the things we've been shown is an awful lot of the things that were wrong, a lot of the mistakes that were made in the fight here. And because of that, there's always been a tendency to kind of gloss over the City Hall, put the fighting aside and just talk about how Sean Connolly was an artist, he was an actor, he fitted into a particular narrative, the role of Kathleen Lynn. But the reality is there's a very, very interesting story happened. Some extraordinary people were involved here, and they really deserve, particularly the likes of Willie Halpin, deserve far greater recognition than they've ever received.
Colm, in honour of your grandfather, Willie, the last commander of the City Hall garrison, I'd like to present you with this sturdy plough and thank you and your family for the commitment that you have given to this city.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Lord Mayor, okay, thank you. Okay.
I'd like to welcome everybody to City Hall. My name is Joe Mooney from the East Wall History Group, and in conjunction with the Cabra and Phibsborough 1916 Committee, we have organised today's events. And it's important to say it was in conjunction with Dublin City Council, and it was through their good office that we're having it in the amazing surroundings of City Hall, which was a 1916 garrison. This afternoon is about people's history. While there's been many great events and many great stories told about 1916, today we're focusing on the people's history. We're focusing on stories that have been put together by community history groups, by family members of people who fought, and also by independent historians that wouldn't necessarily go along with the orthodoxy of the history. So there's a great programme of events. We're kicking off at 12 with the fight for City Hall. You'll find out exactly what happened in this building 100 years ago. It's followed up by 1916, an urban battle, looking at the military aspects in the city at war. It'll then be followed by a family under fire telling the story in great detail of one of the civilian casualties. That will be followed by a performance by the East Wall Drama and Variety Group from the Lockout to Revolution, which will try and give a flavour of what it was like for people going from the turmoil of 1913 to being on the battlefield of 1916 in the city. That will be followed by the rebels of Cabra and Phibsborough, telling the story of many people who have never really been heard about, never had their stories told. And then we'll finish up with coming on in GPO. Maeve O'Leary, whose grandmother and grandfather both served at GPO garrison, will be telling the story of her families and how they came together. We're just going to ask the Deputy Lord Mayor, Councillor Cieran Perry, to officially open the event.
Good morning and welcome to today's events. I'd like to thank the organisers, the East Wall Historical Group and the Cabra 1916 Committee. And just to say it's an absolute honour to be asked to open such an event, particularly in the settings where we now find ourselves, given the historical context of 100 years ago. And the point of today's events is to show the history of what happened in this city, the history that may not be seen through the eyes of the state broadcaster or the other state organisations. It's of huge importance that communities themselves discover their own history. And the organisers of today's event are just two groups across the city who are making similar statements, who are having similar projects to highlight what went on in their communities across this city. And it's, as I've said, it's extremely important because we get a jaundiced view of our history through the establishment. They're only too happy to ignore the revolutionary aspects of what happened 100 years ago in this country. Well, today's events, we've both professional historians and we've community historians. And it gives a good cross-section, the programme gives a good cross-section of the type of information that has been found by both professional and community historians. So we have a very full list of days events, so I won't take up any more time, and just to welcome people here and congratulate the organisers again and congratulate all the speakers. Good amount of good. The first speaker will be Hugo McGuinness, and his topic will be the history of what actually happened here 100 years ago. Good morning, good.
Hi, how are you? You're very welcome to the historic battlefield site from 1916 of Dublin City Hall. And while some of the fighting did actually take place in the chamber here that we're sitting in, most of the battlefield is up there on the roof. And I'm going to go into that in quite a bit of detail and show you what it looked like and show you what happened there. And at this stage, I'd like to say thanks to the Chief Executive's Office of Dublin City Council, who gave me permission to get up on the roof and take photographs that are used in the presentation today. And I'd also like to thank Ray Glynn, the man on the desk down here, who took me up there and pointed out an awful lot of things that I probably have missed. But we're under pressure for time, so we'll get going. This is Sean Connolly. Sean Connolly's a man under pressure. A couple of weeks before the rising, he's told he's going to have the honour to be the only commander in 1916 who's going to actually lead an attack. Everyone else is going to defend a position, but he is going to attack Dublin Castle. Of all the commanders in the Citizen Army, he is the only one who has no military experience. He's got a new uniform. He's got a pair of top boots from Burke's, the theatrical costume suppliers, which were just up the road here. Everyone says he looks like Robert Emmet. This is Robert Emmet, the last man to lead an attack on Dublin Castle in 1803. By Sunday night, he's really feeling the pressure. Across the road from Liberty Hall, the Cllr family have been baking griddle breads and transferring them over to Liberty Hall. They've got hold of a little bread cutters and they're cutting the bread. Sean Connolly's trying to get morale up because of the countermanding order, and he decides to have a go on the bread cutters, and he cuts his thumb. He's worried now, will he be able to fire a rifle? He should be getting his team ready. The problem is, he's organising the guard on Liberty Hall. He's organising meetings. He's organising orders. He's got so many things to do, he doesn't have time to prepare for what's going to be the most important action of his life. And this is his team. This is the City Hall garrison. There's about 90% of them are here in these photographs. They're not soldiers. You've got people like John O'Keefe, a political activist from 1908, when he joined the Irish Republican Socialist Party. You've got the likes of Bill O'Mahon, who's an apprentice jeweller. Again, a lot of these people here are apprentices. You've got Willie Halpin, who's a shop steward at the Dublin Dockyards. That's what these people do. Helena Maloney, she's an actress, like Sean Connolly, who's an actor with the Abbey Theatre. He also works in one of the offices that would have been based around here, and I'll show you a picture of what that looked like later on. But he also works in the Abbey Theatre. He worked in the motor permits section in this building. A lot of these, most of their experiences come from the 1913 lockout. Some of them, like this lady here, Bessie Lynch, had gone to jail for their strike work, for their activity during strike duties. But by and large, these aren't soldiers. This is the sum total of the military experience of what is going to be one of the most complex plans of the Rising. George Gagan had served with the 8th Royal Dublin Fusiliers, and Tom Daly had served with the Royal Artillery. There's no artillery involved in this battle. But let's just go back for a second, Joe. But These are the people that you need when you have so many inexperienced people. And most of those people we're just looking at are between 15 and 26. There's a few are in their 30s, one or two in their 40s, but most of them are between 15 and 26. And these are the kind of guys who can calm down a situation when people are losing their cool. They can tell them a little story about what happened to them while they were on a campaign. Sean Connolly doesn't have these. And these are the people who come up with the plan. Joe Plunkett drew up most of the plan for the Rising, but on Dublin Castle, James Connolly has a huge input. And they come up with a simple but beautiful plan. They won't actually occupy Dublin Castle. What they're going to do is control access in and out of it. That way, the British won't be able to get in, they won't be able to use it as a base to launch attacks. And on paper, it's good, but this man, Michael Mallon, who's the most experienced of all the ex-soldiers in the Irish Citizen Army, when he looks at it, he goes, the timing's too tight. There's very little leeway room in the plan for something to go wrong. And the one thing everybody knows about the Citizen Army is you can ask them to do anything except turn up on time. They just won't. This man here is Tommy Coyle. Now, he's one of the few people out of all the people who are going to form the Citizen Army garrison who have the type of experience that's going to be necessary. This man's a roofer. He knows how to stay on a roof for up to 10, 12 hours a day. And this is an area shot of what's going to be the battlefield site for most of this area here. You've got the City Hall is here, where we are, the Rates Office over here, the main guard is here, and just behind it here is the Bedford Tower. And that's going to prove crucial in what happened here between Monday and Tuesday of Easter week 1916. And then over here, you have Henry and James, outfitters. And just down here, you have the mail office. And that's going to be where most of the fighting takes place here. Now the plan is, Sean Connolly and his number two, Jack O'Reilly, are going to take this building and the building across the way from us, the Rates Office. Tom Kane is going to take, and his team are going to move in here to the main guard, which is just over there. George O'Mahon was supposed to lead a small team to take over the back gate at Ship Street into the Dublin Castle complex. George is sent out in the morning, he doesn't get back in time, and around 11:30, his younger brother Bill is told, "You're now the section leader." John O'Keefe, and again the small team, is going to go up to the Synod House beside Christchurch, and they're going to take over the Synod House so that they can back up Bill O'Mahon down here, but they can also potentially stop any troops that are going to come down Thomas Street, James Street, etc., to try and come in the back of the castle. And then Martin Kelly and the team are going to come over here to the mail office, and they're going to be able to control anything that happens coming across Cable Street. They can also fight back up towards where John O'Keefe is, and then anything that comes up from Dane Street. And backing them up as well as this man Evan Elms and his team. Now again, this man here is Stephen King. This is his brother Arthur. They spent the morning going around cutting cables to cut the communications around the city, and then as they get back to Liberty Hall, they're told, "Oh, by the way, you're off to the City Hall." This whole operation needs a lot of coordination. There's none. Basically, all the teams have been put together like a street football team. It's just, who's available? I'll have you, I'll have you, I'll have you. But there's no specialists, there's a lack of experience, and that's all going to come to bear when everything goes down. And then we have the women. Kathleen Lynn is the Chief Medical Officer in the Citizen Army. She's a doctor. Her role is purely medical. She has nothing to do with military affairs. The military affairs of the women are dealt with by these two women, Helena Maloney and Ginny Shannon. But although most of the women's role in the City Hall will be either acting as nurses, dressing wounds, making the food, making the tea, they've all been armed. On the Friday evening, a woman called Marie Paroles goes down Sheriff Street, she buys pistols, and James Connolly gives every one of these women a pistol and tells them, only use it in the last resort. But they are all armed, and if the crunch comes, there are quite a number of them who'd be ready to use the pistols. We don't know what time Sean Connolly left Liberty Hall, for certain. His orders were the first shot to be fired at the strike of the Angelus bell, which means 12 o'clock. His younger brother, Matty, says he reckons it was about 10 to 12. That's way too late to get into position. But they had so much to do, it's not surprising. They left Liberty Hall and they could have crossed Footbridge to Tower Street. They stop at Tower Street because his brother Joe is a fireman at Tower Street. But in his team is Matty, there's a sister Kitty, his brother George, and little brother Eddie. So it's understandable that they would stop, but they shouldn't have, because they're now losing precious minutes.
My name's John Dorney. I'm a historian. I'm author of Peace After the Final Battle, The Story of the Irish Revolution, and editor of the Irish Story website. I'm here in City Hall today, which was the scene of fighting in 1916, to talk about 1916 as an urban battle. I wanted to take us back to the fact that 1916 was not just a symbolic event, that it was a real urban battle, that many people died, that it affected civilians, that the British Army deployed a lot of force here, that the volunteers, although they fought tenaciously, probably didn't have a strategy to win, but that they, on occasion, that they used elements of urban guerrilla warfare that resulted in the death of a lot of British soldiers. I've talked about the civilian casualties. The civilians were disproportionate victims of the rising. More civilians were killed than either of the two combatant sides put together. It was the rebels' fault for launching the rebellion, launching the rising in the first place. But for me, the evidence suggests that the British Army was responsible for most of the actual deaths. The British Army was also responsible for the only targeted, deliberate killing of civilians, which was on North King Street, where 16 men and boys were killed and buried in many cases in basements and gardens.
Apparently was heard saying, we'll fight in the mountains.
But what we see around us today, that thankfully Dublin is a very peaceful city, a very tranquil city, that in many other parts of the world we have bloody urban battles to compare with 1916, and when we think of the Rising we should think not only of the symbolic value but of the human story and of the hardship and relate it to warfare in our own time.
I'm Christine Connolly. We live in England, in Cheshire now. My dad was born over here in Dublin, and his granddad, my great-granddad, was Daniel Courtney, who was a member of the GPO garrison, a member of the Citizen Army, and my great-uncle Barney was also involved. I think he was at Jacobs, and then he went to Stephen's Green. It's a fascinating story. I knew nothing about this until about 5 or 6 years ago, I think, and I can't stop looking now. It's just incredible. Dad never spoke about his childhood at all. They came over to England in we think about 1915, but we've no records of that. And just not long after they came over to England, my dad and his parents, my grandparents split up, so I know nothing about my grandfather either, who was called Patrick Collins, and how many millions of Patrick Collins are there? So that's my next investigation, I suppose.
Daniel Courtney was one of the founders of the Citizen Army, but he was also, the catalyst for him was he gets evicted.
Yeah.
And one of the things we shouldn't forget about him is he was a very significant trade unionist.
Yeah, yeah.
He wasn't one of the ones who kept records. He didn't write it down.
Right.
It's just, but he was a very important organiser down
yeah.
the docks.
Yeah.
And made huge sacrifices.
Yeah.
Whereas he gave up a good job.
Because in 1913 he had quite a good job, and he was literate, and his handwriting was very good. Yeah.
You know.
And it's interesting because his grandson Charles, who lived here in Dublin, was also a great unionist. He was General Secretary, I think, of, you know, was it transport workers? I'm not sure.
I think it was Imetu.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yes, he was.
yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think it's the 1970s, he ends up negotiating with the Merchants Warehousing Company.
Yeah.
And he was a man who was known for being very quiet.
Oh,
very calm.
very.
And he walked into the meeting and just slams his desk down, slams his bag down on the desk, and just walked out.
I've heard this.
And left everybody in shock.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell the rest of the story?
Yeah, that he said that you were the people who evicted my grandfather, nothing to do with you. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And they didn't know. No, it was a tactic, but it was brilliant.
Yeah.
But that's another thing you find with the Citizen Army is there's a tradition of Labour politics going back a couple of generations, and it comes forward right down to the present day.
Yeah.
That even Alan is involved in trade unions.
Well, it wasn't. I mean, they were fighting. It was so unjust, and the way they were living was just so dreadful. And it, as I said to you a few minutes ago, this past couple of weeks have made me quite ashamed to be English in a way. But I'm more Irish than English, perhaps. Hopefully. My dad never spoke about it, my granddad, I know nothing about. The only grandparent I knew was Catherine, Daniel Courtney's eldest daughter, who left Ireland round about 1916, which again is another thing, you know, and never came back to Ireland again. So there was obviously some kind of family disagreement there, which I'm sure wasn't unusual in those times, you know.
It could have also been work.
Possibly, and then maybe. But it's fascinating trying to find out, but we'll carry on anyway. So but your article, the Daniel Courtney, the grandfather, that was just unbelievable. And of course you mentioned Barney, because he was hardly referred to at all, and yet I believe that his funeral was one of the first, and he was only 17. He died of TB. He did. We found his grave in Glasnevin, and then of course Julia died 1923, I think, didn't she?
That's right.
Yeah. So it was a very sad story, and yet he must have been such a character, Daniel. Fantastic, feisty bloke.
He obviously loved children, because he used to entertain them.
Really?
Every year. That's where the term the grandfather of the Citizen
Oh, I
Army
didn't know
comes from.
that.
Yeah, he used to do Santa Claus at their charity
Oh, wow.
for Citizen Army children.
There must be some photographs of him somewhere, mustn't there, of him being Father Christmas?
Sitting on somebody's wall.
Wow.
My name is Stephen McCullagh. My grandfather, Bob McCullagh, was a 10-year-old boy in 1916. He told me the story when I lived with him during my teenage years, and repeated the story consistently, really, over the time that I lived with him, about his experiences of the 1916, and how a visitor of the family, William Moore, came to really seek shelter in the house on the way back from a day trip from Limerick. They found themselves that they couldn't get back to Limerick on that evening train, and sought shelter in the family home. Number 4 Annesley Bridge Road had 12 people between the bank holiday Monday and the Thursday morning. And the Thursday morning, when they reckoned all the fighting had stopped, all the shots, they went out to the front of the house and surveyed the front of the house. There were 33 bullets lodged in the brickwork of the house, and there wasn't a pane of glass left. They went back in. My great-grandfather Jack and William Moore went back in to get a sweeping brush, and there was a bang, behind my great-grandfather Jack, and Mr. Moore had been shot in the back. They brought him to the kitchen where he almost died on the kitchen table, and as a 10-year-old boy, obviously this was pretty traumatic. My great-grandfather called the ambulance. The ambulance arrived and took them to Jervis Street, where unfortunately on the way in Mr. Moore died. What was really interesting about the story, and pretty horrific I'm sure at the time, was my great-grandfather went missing for 2 days. Of course the family assumed, with all the fighting and so forth, the worst, and he came back to the door of number 4 Annesley Bridge Road in an awful state. No food, no water. He had been ordered to dig graves for those fallen troops at Jervis Street. For years after, Grandpa would recall this story every time we'd pass on the way into town or on the way back out, of those events related to his experiences of 1916 and really how traumatic it was. He passed on in 2001, but relived that story more times than you'd care to remember. And really, it's all my talk is to try and get people to think more and more about the civilians, the 262 civilians that died as a result of the Rising, and how they were really caught up in something that they didn't know anything about. So, thank you very much. And William and his new bride had decided to take the day and go out to Howth.
Behind us is the main guard of Dublin Castle, and Veronica's uncle, Jimmy Cllr, was one of the people who was part of the outpost there.
Correct.
Your mother was in Stephen's Green.
She was with the Madam Markovich.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And your grandfather was in Stephen's Green as well.
John Cllr, yeah.
The rest of the family lived in Beresford Place.
Correct.
On Friday and Saturday, they actually baked all the bread to make the sandwiches for the Citizen Army.
Right.
Yeah. Do you want to tell the story of that?
Well, hold on, I don't know what to say. All I know is my mother told us that she was doing the dispatches in the Green for the Madam, and that they were asked to make some bread for the crowd in Liberty Hall.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether that would fit in with what baking.
You still have the griddle pan.
We still have the griddle pan, yes, that she made the scones on, yes.
And they made hundreds.
Hundreds, so I believe, yes.
And this is how Sean Connolly cuts his thumb trying to slice them up.
Yes, that's correct. Sean was the first man to be shot.
That's right.
Yes, that's right.
And then your Uncle Jimmy was only about 16, 17 at the time that he was here.
No, my mother was 16. So I think, would he be a little bit older?
He would have only been a year or two.
Yeah, they only a year or two.
They were incredibly young.
Yeah, they were all very young, yes. And my grandfather served his sentence in Frongoch in Wales.
Yeah,
as well. And James, or Jimmy as you call him, he was on the run for a while.
Yeah.
So
he was on the run with George Connolly.
George.
Who was Sean Connolly's brother.
Yes.
And there's a story that George married a Cllr, and they think it would have been your mother's cousin.
All right, yes,
That they were, because your mother says that one of them, he didn't actually come home. He went missing for a few days.
He did, yes.
Yeah.
There was a man.
And it seems he went to the cousins, and George Connolly found a bit of romance.
Oh, right.
Even though the main guard here didn't really work out that well.
Yes,
George had a bit of success at the end.
My name is Brian Hanley. I'm a member of the Cabra 1916 Rising Committee, and I'm talking today about the rebels of Cabra and Phibsborough. In 1916, there was a substantial number of people from Phibsborough and the North Circular Road and the Cabra area involved in the Rising as members of the Irish Volunteers, Cumann na mBan, Hibernian Rifles, and also in the Citizens' Army. And also the area saw some very significant combat on the first 2 days of the Rising. The rebels from the Four Courts area had extended their line as far as the North Circular Road and the Cabra Road. They set up barricades there, and there'd been plans to destroy the railway lines and to try and cut off British reinforcements coming into the city. These plans didn't come off for a variety of reasons. Far less numbers were available to the volunteers than they'd hoped. And on the Tuesday, large numbers of British reinforcements arrived into Dublin, and a lot of them arrived through the Phoenix Park along the North Circular Road. The 4 18-pounder guns that were later used to shell O'Connell Street were actually brought in from Athlone along the North Circular, and their first use in Dublin was against the barricades on the North Circular and the Cabra roads, and several civilians were killed in Phibsborough by the shelling as well. And the area was occupied then by the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, and over the next week under martial law several civilians were shot dead in that area by British troops. There was fairly intense fighting on the Tuesday. The rebels retreated. Some managed to escape, some got as far as Glasnevin Cemetery where they stayed overnight, and then they made their way out to Ashbourne and actually took part in the actions out there. Some were captured, some escaped and went home, effectively dropped out, and others got back into the city centre and got to the GPO, and some of them were then in the GPO until the surrender on the Saturday of Easter week. So there was, once we began to investigate what had happened in the area during the rising, we found out, one, there was a lot of rich detail. We found maybe 80 people who were either from the area or who were in the area during Easter week who were involved in the rising. Also a lot of local stories about how the rising impacted on the civilian population with food shortages and with curfews and martial law, and also then lots of stories about what happens in the years after the rising. And we've come across several hundred people who in later years had taken part in Easter week who later lived in the Cabra Phibsborough area. Who came from the Phibsborough area itself were actually members of the 2nd Battalion, which was based at Jacobs factory on the south side. You also had a number of members, local members of Common Amon, who were active in several areas, including the Four Courts, Church Street and the GPO.